Okay, and now for the final lecture of week one of Economics 352, and let's get into it. So in the last video, basically sort of did two main things. We set up a simple model of the money supply. And again, the basic way to think about the money supply in this context is that the money supply is equal to the monetary base and then times the money multiplier. The money multiplier is a lot of preferences over holding money via cash versus deposits in banks. But there is something that the Fed, or the central bank rather, can do here, and that is they can affect the reserve to deposit ratio. But otherwise, the Fed does not have much influence on currency to deposit ratio. I mean, they can do certain things. They can send certain signals that might induce greater depositing potentially, but very indirect. And then, of course, the monetary base is the main thing that they sort of are able to manipulate. And again, you have to understand is that this is a little bit of a sort of a theoretical idea as to how the central bank controls the money supply. I mean, this has been a very much empirically tested, and we feel very good about this. But it is kind of interesting to think about it in terms of central banking theory. What is the money supply? How would you define it? And then how would you explain how the central bank can affect it? Again, this is one of the things we have to embed into the neoclassical model, because prior there really wasn't much in the way of central banks, and many capitalist industrial countries had sort of rejected the idea of central banks. Certainly, we did in the U.S. And so this development of the idea of the money supply, this development of monetary policy, is something that comes along at the turn of the 20th century. And so it becomes something that really, in hindsight, we feel like we want to embed it into the neoclassical model. It was not really so much done back then. In fact, the history of this is quite interesting. We'll talk about this a little bit in the third week, but this idea of sort of this version of central banking theory, and then what we're going to talk about in just a moment, the quantity equation, was a very old classical idea that was brought back into focus by Milton Friedman in the 1950s and kicked off the so-called monetarist movement. And the focus, of the monetarist movement was on the money supply. There was a strong belief by Friedman and the folks that would consider themselves monetarists that was what the central bank should worry about. They should worry about the money supply, and then worry about the money supply for two key reasons. The first is liquidity. They need to make sure that there is liquidity in the economy. And then the other thing is they have to worry about inflation. And to some extent, those two worries are perpendicular to each other. If you want to reduce inflation, you sort of have to pull back on the money supply. If you want to increase the money supply, you typically put upward pressure on inflation. So it requires a central bank to know what it's doing, to understand its policy set, and to have a clear goal as to what monetary policy is going to be used for. Now, as I've mentioned to you, we want to embed this to some extent in the story of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And so typically when you hear the Federal Reserve, we invoke this concept called the dual mandate. So the dual mandate for the Federal Reserve in the United States is actually a congressionally statutory set of guidelines that basically argues that the Fed should worry about unemployment and inflation. And the Fed's dual mandate is to have low, stable inflation and have low unemployment. And so when we talk about monetary policy in the US, that is the way that we're typically going to frame it, is within the context of the Fed's dual mandate. Now, the dual mandate doesn't come from any sort of necessary economic theory. It's not like the classical or neoclassical models argued that the Fed should have a dual mandate. That was what our government decided to sort of invoke on the Federal Reserve. It's also important to understand in the US, the central bank is independent of the government. They are not a government entity per se, but they have been given, in a sense, this mission by Congress to carry out the dual mandate. And so it's, in a sense, we would think sort of a public-private entity. It is a private institution, but it serves a public good, a public goal. And in particular, that public goal is low stable inflation and low unemployment. And in order for us to have a good idea of how the Federal Reserve or a central bank would carry out something like the dual mandate, or in particular, just if we say that the Federal Reserve is, say, worried about inflation in particular, how are we going to think about that? So what's interesting about this conversation about the sort of interplay between monetary policy and inflation, which is really the interplay between money and inflation, is that there was this idea called the quantity equation that's been around for actually a very long time. It is an idea that was around for much of the 1800s, and it's interesting that it took a long time for the quantity equation to actually really make its way into like what we might consider mainstream economic thought. You just didn't hear it brought up very much amongst the classicals. The individual who is sort of in the kind of modern context most given credit for revitalizing the quantity equation in terms of classical neoclassical economics was Irving Fisher. We've talked about Irving Fisher earlier this semester. He was the economist who built that machine to explain the relationship between the interconnectedness of prices across the economy. So very, very interesting guy. And I think the real genius of Irving Fisher was that he foresaw the importance of monetary policy. He foresaw the importance of central bank policy. And really, if you go back and you look at sort of that neoclassical marginal revolution, he was one of the few people that was really putting in a lot of work to understanding the interplay between money and inflation. And he, again, brought back this idea of the quantity equation. So the quantity equation is a very, very simple idea, but very profound and very powerful. And again, something that we look at today as certainly a part of how we think about money and inflation. There are limitations, there are caveats, of course, with this model as there are any other model, but it's a very, very useful model. And so the idea behind the quantity equation is that we want to sort of focus real quick on this over here. So that right there is nominal GDP. Okay, P times Y is nominal GDP. Y is real GDP, and then P is just price level. And so P times Y is nominal GDP. Now, the reason why this is important is, again, remember, in the classical model, we really don't sort of think too much about prices. Prices aren't really there. We're only thinking about things in terms of real GDP. Well, what Irving Fisher and a lot of folks, of course, were quick to point out is that, in terms of transactions and sort of in day-to-day economic behavior, of course, prices matter greatly. And people's behaviors are impacted by prices. Excuse me, this is one of the reasons why we brought back or we brought into the neoclassical model those consumer theory ideas, utility maximization, substitution, and income effects, right? Because we sort of knew that people were certainly impacted by price changes, but the classical model just didn't really have a way to accommodate this. So going back on those micro foundations was in part a bit of an end around, I think, to actually get prices into a neoclassical model. And Fisher was a big reason why we did that. So P times Y, nominal GDP. So what this says is that the nominal GDP in your economy is going to be equal to the money supply times the velocity of money. Velocity of money just refers to the speed with which a dollar moves around an economy, right? I go and I buy lunch at Culver's. That money is then paid to a Culver's employee. That Culver's employee then goes and buys lunch at McDonald's. McDonald's employee then goes by, so on and so forth, right? My spending is your income is my spending, right? That's a very classical idea, by the way. And I think it's an idea that we don't think a lot about. I think that the general population doesn't think enough about that very classical idea that my income is your income and my spending is your spending ultimately. It's I think very interesting. So the extent to which each dollar is spent, in a sense, the number of times that each dollar is spent is related to the velocity of money. Now, this is important as well because it carries over a bit from a conversation that we had with respect to the money supply. Because one of the things that we know is that you can increase the money supply, and then people actually have to use that increase in the money supply. And so there is the extent to which an increase in the monetary base is going to increase the money supply, which we saw earlier was governed by this money multiplier. But then in addition to that, there is going to be the behavioral response of consumers and businesses to this increase in liquidity, to this increase in actual money supply. And that's where velocity comes in. And so ultimately, all this says is that M times V, money times velocity, is equal to nominal GDP. Now, what we typically do is we typically fix velocity of money. We make it constant. And the reason why this is important is because we also will tend to think about the quantity equation in terms of changes. So change in the money supply plus change in the velocity, change in P and change in Y, right? So this is the quantity equation, and then this is the quantity equation in terms of growth rates, right? M times V equals P times Y. In terms of growth rates, change in M plus change in V equals change in P plus change in Y. And then we will typically make the change in V here is equal to 0 because V is constant. So this just goes away. And then we also will typically make the assumption that real GDP is sort of not changing. In other words, for a given level of real GDP, so with whatever GDP is right now, so you can effectively think about real GDP, excuse me here, real GDP here, change in V is equal to 0, and then the change in Y is just equal to 1. We're sort of thinking about there being, the economy hasn't grown necessarily, right? So we can ignore, in a sense, Y, if you will. And then as a result, what we get is the classic outcome that an increase in the money supply has to coincide with an increase in inflation. That you cannot increase the money supply without increasing the inflation, right? Milton Friedman is famous for saying that everywhere and always inflation is a monetary story. And basically his argument is that the source of inflation, right, change in P is inflation. The source of inflation is the change in the money supply. Everywhere and always inflation is a monetary story. So the interesting thing about this is that it embeds itself actually very well into the classical neoclassical model. Despite the fact that those models didn't really have prices in them, this says ultimately that we can, again, in a sense, ignore nominal GDP, right? All we really need to focus on here is real GDP, because ultimately, the only reason why nominal GDP rises when there is no actual increase in real GDP is because of an increase in inflation. And the only reason why there would be an increase in inflation is because of an increase in the money supply. And so this is where you get this sort of big concern that economists have about the relationship between money supply and inflation. It comes from Irving Fisher bringing back the quantity equation. And so again, this is what Milton Friedman brings back in the 1950s as a response to the Keynesian revolution. Because, a bit of a spoiler here, the Keynesians were not as worried about inflation. And in a sense, the sort of classical, neoclassical, I think not putting the quantity equation at the forefront of those models, perhaps not celebrating Irving Fisher as much as we should have, meant that the Keynesians were somewhat blind to the quantity equation. And that's certainly what Milton Friedman argued in the 1950s and 1960s. And it's what's interesting about his argument is that in many ways, he becomes vindicated by the stagflation era, and the Keynesians really sort of, look like they have eggs on their faces for ignoring things like the quantity equation. The cool thing about the quantity equation is that for given levels of M and Y, and then if we assume that change in V is zero, we can relatively easily back out inflation rates. And so we can see to what extent the rate of growth in money supply corresponds to inflation. And again, in the quantity equation, it's basically one for one. So the quantity equation argues that if everything else is held constant in this model, any increase in the money supply in the short run, in the immediate, is merely going to translate into inflation, right? You have that classic idea of more dollars chasing same number of goods. It's a classic economic idea. More dollars chasing the same number of goods. And first Fisher and Friedman and the other monetarists will argue that that is the source of our inflationary problems. And then here's just some simple numerical examples for you to work through. Okay, and the last thing that we're going to talk about in this embedding of money into the neoclassical model is we're going to talk about the actual Fisher effect. Fisher became really interested in the interplay between inflation and interest rates. Again, the classical model did very good on interest rates. The classical model, I think, did a great job to develop the idea and the importance of interest rates into the equilibration of the economic system, but it ignored the inflationary story. Fisher brought those two stories together and argued, and certainly something that we tend to agree with even today, is that there was a relationship between real interest rates and inflation, right? Because if you've paid attention to my language up to this point, when we've talked about interest rates in the macroeconomy, we've used the term real interest rate, right? Well, in terms of like actual lending and things like that, there are sticker price interest rates, right? There are nominal interest rates, right? The I. And then the idea is that regardless of what the nominal rate is, you are going to pay a real rate. And much like the classical and neoclassical ideas that came before, the real rates are what ultimately are going to matter. And what Fisher argued and had a lot of evidence to support was that nominal interest rates were equal to real interest rates plus inflation. Or to put it another way, real interest rates were equal to nominal interest rates minus inflation. So there was a reductive component to inflationary pressure on the economy with respect to interest rates. So one of the things that Fisher observed was that the countries would have the ability, in a sense, to inflate away their debt because of this real interest rate sort of idea. And it sets up all these interesting kind of conversations about the nature of debt and the interplay that we have with inflation, right? If you're in a lot of debt, you actually want a lot of inflation because inflation makes your debt cheaper, which is a little bit of a counterintuitive idea. And anytime you have a counterintuitive idea, that's what makes it most powerful. That's what makes it most profound. And the Fisher effect is, I think, in some sense, a bit of a counterintuitive idea. However, as we develop a more broad and a more specific understanding of the way in which monetary policy, money, and inflation play out in the economy, and we'll certainly get to that next week, I think you'll find that the Fisher effect is something that ends up making a lot of sense ultimately. Now, the interesting thing here with respect to the Fisher effect is that economists typically tend to think about inflation not just in terms of its actual value, but in terms of its expected value. So inflation is very much an expectations-driven sort of concept. And the reason why that's important is because the inflation that we tend to expect is the inflation that we create today. So one of the ideas that we'll talk about when we get to the third week of the term is this idea as to whether inflation expectations are actually equal to inflation itself. So there's this sense that whenever you think there's going to be inflation, you will alter your behavior in result to expected inflation, and that will tend to cause inflation. And so there's a really interesting set of ideas that we'll talk about that relates to this idea of inflation expectation. So again, the Fisher effect is something that we sort of lay out right now, but we're going to come back to it many times throughout the term. Okay, and then this is just some graphs, some data for us to kind of peruse real quick, just to sort of give you an idea of, again, the interplay between monetary policy and interest rates. So you can see here we have the 3-month Treasury bill, that is the blue line, and then we have CPI inflation, which is the red line. And sort of what you'll notice, of course, is that typically when inflation is up, then you'll see there is a response with higher interest rates. And so you can see right here, right? So inflation starts to kick up, and then we have higher interest rates, right? Inflation is kicking up, we have higher interest rates. Kicking up, higher interest rates, right? So the Fed is responding to all of this inflationary pressure with higher interest rates. And then look at this era right here, right? This is the Volcker era of the Fed, right? Paul Volcker, who induces the 80-81 recession by virtue of very, very high interest rates. And of course, the goal of that was to bring inflation down. So you see this separation between interest rates and inflation here. In fact, inflation falls far below the interest rates here, and that was on purpose. Volcker was creating a recession to bring down inflation. And then the story kind of moving forward with the economy is the stability of inflation, right? Think back to dual mandate, right? What's the dual mandate of the Fed? Low, stable inflation and low unemployment, right? Low, stable inflation, low unemployment. Look at that. Low, stable inflation, right? Seems like they might have done a pretty good job there. And then here's inflation expectations and the nominal interest rate. Again, just to give you that idea of the Fisher effect. So you see, again, a lot of interplay between these ideas here, lots of interplay. We're going to look at a lot of data this term, don't worry. Oops, sorry. My computer is, there we go. There we go. It's becoming unwieldy here at the end. All right. And then the last thing that we'll sort of finish up here is just this idea of interest rates and inflation in terms of money demand. This ends up being, again, the way in which we ultimately embed the sort of concept of money into the classical and neoclassical model. And then this becomes a really important idea that we work through the Keynesian revolution next week. So I just want to kind of put this idea into your head, this idea of money demand in the economy. And then we're going to think about this in the same way that we thought about it, things before, is that there's going to be an equilibrating process in the economic system with respect to money demand and money supply. And ultimately, this is going to matter because this is going to be the way in which we are able to illustrate monetary policy, its effect on interest rates, and ultimately its effect on the sort of macro economy. So real quick, just to kind of set this up ahead of next week, let's take you through a very simple model of the money market, what we would refer to as the money market. All right, so in the money market, we're going to have real money balances here on the horizontal axis. That's just money supply divided by the price level. And then we're going to have real interest rates on the vertical axis. And then what we're going to have here is that we're going to have a stock of the money supply, M over P. And then we're going to have, so we can think about this, sometimes you'll see this written this way. So money supply, and then we're going to have, as you would expect, a money demand with the sort of level of money supply relating to the equilibrium interest rate. And so if the Fed wants to carry out expansionary monetary policy, they push the money supply out this way, so M over P, and then the result of this is that it causes interest rates to decline, right? If the Fed wants to carry out contractionary monetary policy, they reduce the money supply that way, and this causes all else equal interest rates to rise. So a very simple model of the money supply. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can relate this very simple model of the money supply back to what is ultimately this idea of aggregate demand. Okay, so at this point, we have set all of this up. Oops. Oh, it's my tablet crashed. Apologies. Let me see if I can bring this back real quick. Okay. Hopefully it won't crash this time. Let's see. Okay, looks good. All right. So we've done aggregate supply, right? Aggregate supply comes from the production function of the economy. We have not really developed aggregate demand. But now that we have the money market, we're actually able to do that. So let's start with this idea of you have aggregate demand, and then you have the money market. Aggregate demand, and then the money market. Money market is in equilibrium with real money balances and money demand, okay? So let's start with this idea. Here we have three different real money balance situations relative to different price level situations. So we can see when the price goes down that the real money balances increase, and this puts downward pressure on interest rates. We can see when the price level increases to P1, this puts upward pressure on interest rates. What this tells us is that there's a positive relationship generally in the classical and neoclassical model between prices and interest rates, okay? In the context of the money market in particular, okay? Important to keep that in mind. In the context of the money market, there's a positive relationship between interest rates and prices. Then we think about expenditure, okay? We think about people spending money. We think about consumption. We think about investment, right? And we know what those relationships are. We know that if interest rates go down, expenditure goes up, right? So that lower R2 interest rate is corresponding to higher expenditure. That higher R1 interest rate is corresponding to corresponding to lower expenditure. We also know that expenditure is related to output, right? And so if expenditure goes up, output goes up. If expenditure goes down, output goes down. Last piece of it, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Remember, Say's law. In the classical, neoclassical model, we pretty much think supply creates demand. What this means is that it's going to be supply, aggregate supply, which moves to equilibrate with aggregate demand. And what we've established previous is that higher levels of prices are associated with higher interest rates. Higher interest rates are associated with lower expenditure. Lower expenditure is associated with lower output. So high prices, lower output. We also have seen lower interest rates are associated with higher expenditure, which are associated with higher levels of output. Low prices, high output. And that's where we get our aggregate demand curve comes from. So at P1, we had Y1 output. At P0, we had Y0 output. And at P2, we had Y2 output. The aggregate supply is going to move to keep the economy in equilibration. And what we have is the classic downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So now we've put it all together. We've taken the classical and neoclassical models, developed those ideas, micro foundations. We then took money, embedded into the neoclassical model, and now we have a full concept of aggregate supply or aggregate demand in the neoclassical sense. Pretty cool. See you next week.